Alright, so in Lesson 2 we're going to discuss poetry. Which is the oldest literary genre. As I've mentioned, we're taking several approaches in this class as we make our way through the different literary texts. One of those approaches is looking at different genres. Genre is a broad term. It can mean types and styles of writing. It can also mean categories. Types or styles would be the way we're looking at it here with poetry. Next lesson we'll turn our attention to mythology. Later on we'll look at drama and fiction and eventually comics and film. But you could also have categories, say action, adventure, comedy, science fiction, etc. So, as I mentioned last time, we're also covering some of the oldest genres first, poetry and mythology, before we dive into the themes of the course to kind of get our ground set in some chronology. The first couple texts we're looking at, Blake last time and then Hopkins this time, are not necessarily in chronological order, but beginning with the third lesson when we look at mythology, because mythology is really the oldest form of literature. It was just written in poetic form. And so poetry and mythology kind of go hand in hand as being the two oldest forms, or two oldest genres. So we'll start moving more chronological order with the text, beginning next time with mythology. I just chose two examples that I thought would work really well for the points I was trying to convey in Lesson 1 and Lesson 2. In Lesson 1, I think looking at Blake, a poem with more supernatural elements and another with fewer supernatural elements, really illustrates the point about reality in literature. And then Hopkins' poem today just provides a wealth of material for studying poetry. So many images, but it's kind of a big poem and a small poem at the same time. It's longer than most short poems, but it's not super long, and it's also not difficult to understand, but still rich with symbols and imagery and other things that are easy to analyze in poetry. So it's just a great example. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the background of poetry. It's the oldest literary genre, and that's primarily because it could be spoken. As you'll see as the semester goes on, literacy rates among the general population all throughout the world were very low, especially in England and the US until the mid-19th century. And then you start to see a shift where the novel becomes more popular. But for thousands of years, millennia, really, poetry was the dominant genre because it could be spoken out loud. And in fact, it really often should be spoken out loud. Sometimes I would say that's the best way to experience poetry, because in the 20th century, 21st century, now that literacy rates are higher, sometimes poems aren't necessarily written to be spoken, but they almost always are. And so that's an important thing to think about as you read. Also, poetry is the style, I guess you would say, used for the epic. We'll talk more about the epic next time because it's a key part of mythology. But these terms, style, form, genre, they kind of overlap and can be used in different ways. So I would call poetry, mythology, they're all genres, but the form is poetic, and it's part of mythology, so they certainly overlap. But Gilgamesh is the first epic poem. It's also the first literary text we know of. We haven't been able to discover anything dated further back than Gilgamesh. So it's an epic. It's written in verse form. It's a poem, and it's part of mythology. And again, we'll talk more about mythology next time. But for these reasons, poetry is the oldest literary genre. You have a variety of lengths of poems. You have short poems that are often referred to as lyric poems, and then longer poems that are most often epics. You do have some examples of longer poems that are not epics. For instance, in the 19th century, you had some dramatic monologues by Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning that were very long, but not epics. And then you have what I would call intermediate poems. I can't think of a better term, but they're much longer than short poems. And then nowhere near as long as an epic. So you were probably asked to read in high school at some point T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. That's a great example of a poem that's certainly a long poem, but is a far cry from an epic. And the Wreck of the Deutschland, even though it's much shorter than The Wasteland, I would still put it in that category, because certainly you can see the difference between it and something like Blake. Long poems in the epic were the predominant form for a long time. Although you go all the way back to ancient Egypt and ancient Rome, you do see some examples of shorter, more lyric poems too. So some things to look for in poetry. I put this on here because I myself, as a lifelong student of literature, struggle more with poetry probably than any other genre or form or style. We talked a bit about narrative last time and how almost everything has a narrative. Poetry might be one exception. I mean, it does have a narrative. You follow the events that happen in the Chimney Sweeper. But when you get into short poems, in really short poems, this is probably the farthest I think we get from traditional narrative. And I'm a very narrative-driven person, so novels and plays I have a better time analyzing than poetry. So my goal here is to give you some of the strategies I use, and hopefully they work for you too. Look for imagery. With few exceptions throughout the canon and all of literature, poetry should really have strong images. I mean, all writing should, novels too, plays you see the images, but poetry, because you have typically so few words, the author really strives typically to provide really vivid images that you can unpack and go in depth with. So finding an image, looking at the adjectives, the words that describe it, and saying, what is the author trying to tell us with this image? That can be very helpful to understanding poetry, and that's what I'm going to ask you to do with this lesson in the discussion board. Tone is also important. What kind of feelings is the author trying to invoke in you, and how does it sound? How is the author talking? Is it gloomy? Is it hopeful? Is it angry? Is it mournful? There's obviously tone in longer works like novels too, but again, when you're interacting more directly with that speaker and you have a shorter work, tone takes on a greater importance in terms of analysis and what to look for. Rhyme and meter. Now this is something that is very unique to poetry. I'd often compare poetry to music. And when we analyzed the Mumford & Sons song in the last lecture, you have a prime example. I mean, that's essentially poetry, if you ask me. It's just been set to music. So when you read a poem, you can count the lines or count the syllables in the lines and see, is this line 8 syllables long or 6 syllables long, etc. Blake is a very rhythmic poet. Some poets are more rhythmic than others. His poem The Tiger, which we didn't read, but you can look up, it's very short, is a very rhythmic poem, and if you read it with the syllables, you can really get the feeling of the rhythm. It would be easy to set to music. That's not to say that all poems follow some kind of pattern with the rhyme and meter. You've heard of free verse and other things like that, where poets intentionally try to define, challenge structure and have a rhyme and meter that makes no sense. And those poems are much less rhythmic. That's more of a 20th, 21st century, maybe late 19th century kind of thing. Whitman is probably the first poet to really do it in the mid-19th century in the U.S. To any great extent. And again, that's an intentional kind of resistance of traditional style. So that'd be, free verse is what we call that. Rhyme scheme. So this is also important. You've probably seen the layout before of what the rhyme scheme follows. Is it A, B, A, B, A, B, C, A, B, C, B, A, B, A. It can be all kinds of things. But basically you would use a letter to symbolize each line that rhymes. And so you can look up, I didn't include them on here, but you can look up different rhyme schemes and structures and see what order the rhymes come in. And there's a wide variety of reasons an author might do that. It could be part of the rhythm. It could be to evoke a certain feeling. So again, rhyme and meter and rhyme scheme are things that, whereas tone and imagery you can find in any type of literary genre, those rhyme and meter and rhyme scheme are unique to poetry. Theme, again, is important, like imagery and tone, in all works. Probably not more so in poetry than other works, but again, what is this poem trying to say? What are the ideas it's bringing forward? That's a question you can ask of anything. Any literary text. The difference here is you can look at the imagery, the tone, the rhyme, the meter, the rhyme scheme, and see how those bring the theme to light. They work together in that sense. And that's another way poems are like songs. You have these elements working together in this smaller text, so you can unpack and analyze by looking for those things. The example of a poem I chose for us today is Hopkins' The Wreck of the Deutschland. So I'll give you a little bit of background on Hopkins first. He was a Jesuit priest, part of the Catholic order in Great Britain, during the late 19th century, and he became famous posthumously. He basically wrote, in seclusion. For a Catholic priest, it wouldn't make sense to be publishing poems. So, he wrote, and then after he died, his poems were discovered and published. But since then, he's become, at least in the canon and in literary circles, quite famous for several reasons that we'll go through. Striking imagery is one of those reasons. We'll come back to Crisis in Faith in a minute. Sprung rhythm is another. Sprung rhythm is drawing out syllables, some syllables, holding them out longer, and then reading other ones quickly. So here's two letters here as an example. The A is the accent, and the E the reverse direction. They don't have to be over the A and the E. Those are just the two easiest letters to use for examples. So when I was finding a PDF version of The Wreck of the Deutschland for you to read, I intentionally found one that has these accents. So when you read it, you can read for the sprung rhythm. And this creates a certain effect. Typically, if you're looking at a line and it has both types of accents, the drawn out one will come first. So that leads to a longer sound, and then it gets quicker at the end. And that's why that word sprung, the onomatopoeia, which is when a word sounds like its name, or its name describes the sound, you can see how it's springing forth. You have a long syllable and then it gets quicker. And so it's a very interesting pace. So try to read that way when you read the poem. I've also included, because I said earlier that poetry is meant to be heard and read aloud, a YouTube link at the end of this lecture with the link to listen to a really great version of someone reading The Wreck of the Deutschland. It's about 20 minutes long, so it's not too long. I opted not to play it in the lecture, but you can hear the voice actor. I'm not sure who it is, but they're doing a great job. You can hear him reading with the sprung rhythm. So if you have time to watch that or listen to that, please do, and listen for the sprung rhythm, and try to read for the sprung rhythm too when you're reading the poem. He's also known for in-stress, which is a more weighty concept. It's not a poetic technique. It's a philosophical viewpoint. It derives from a medieval idea. I can't remember the name of the person it originated from. You can look that up. Called endscape, which is the idea that our identities are not static, but they're fluid and dynamic. We don't have a stable, fixed identity. Our identity is constantly changing. So that's the first portion of it. That's fairly straightforward. The next is that each being in the universe, human, animal, etc., acts out this identity. We perform it. So our identity changes, but you can see our identity in who we are and how we act. The one, is current state. Human beings, though, this is the next step, are unique and different, say, than animals and other creatures, because we have the ability to recognize the endscape of other beings, to see their identity and identify it. And that's what end stress is. So the first 2 points here come from the older medieval idea of endscape, and then Hopkins' idea that he introduces is the end stress here. And you'll see this in his poem. I mean, you'll see it in The Wreck of the Deutschland, and we'll turn to analysis of that in a minute. But the ability, it's to boil it down more simply, it's essentially the ability to identify with other human beings. Not necessarily sympathy, perhaps closer to empathy, but that still might not be the best word to describe it. It's one of those words where it's a goofy sounding term, right? End stress. So normally I'd substitute it with a more straightforward one, but there's just not a term to encapsulate it. But that recognition, identification would be the closest thing of a fellow suffering or fellow similar experience in another individual. And this ability of end stress leads one to Christ. So this is where the Christian element comes in for Hopkins. Is going back to that idea in Genesis that human beings are made in God's image and likeness, and that separates them from animals, though they have dominion over the animals. And so for Hopkins, this is the reason why. This is how we are like God, is we're able to see and identify and recognize with the other human beings. And so these three things here, striking imagery, which if you've read the poem already you know about, sprung rhythm, and end stress, these three things are what made Hopkins very famous when his poetry was discovered after he passed away. The last point I want to mention that actually came up earlier is the Victorian crisis in faith. The Victorian period is simply a term used to refer to the time when Hopkins lived. Victoria was queen from 1836 to 1901, and the literary movement most prominent during this time would be called realism, but in Britain it's just referred to as the Victorian period because Victoria was queen. Hopkins isn't really a realist. He's probably closer to modernism, which makes sense that his poems would be read and appreciated more so in the 20th century. But because of Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species and a number of other things, the very, very Christian Victorian population experienced a crisis in faith during the 19th century. And that term of crisis in faith refers to where you have a predominantly Christian or other religious population, and something happens or a number of things happen that lead to a large number of people questioning their faith. This happened in the U.S. also earlier in the 18th century due to the influence of Enlightenment thinking, and it eventually led to a religious revival called the Great Awakening. So for Victorians it was a combination of factors, but the big kind of catalyst was Darwin's Origin of Species. And so for Hopkins, he experienced the crisis of faith as well, especially because he was a priest and he was training to be a priest, as the crisis in faith was happening. And so if you read his volume of poetry, his canon, read more poems beyond the one I've put on the syllabus for today, you will see that there are poems, God's Grandeur, Pied Beauty, where he's really expressing his belief in God, and then other times where he's struggling with it. So there's a very kind of personal element to his poems, whereas other authors had a more publicly acknowledged crisis of faith. Hopkins was a very private person. Alright, let's turn to the actual poem. So this is inspired by real events, so to speak. If they were to make a movie out of it, it would have that based on a true story tagline. The SS Duschen was a German ship that set sail and sank in 1875. Hopkins wrote the poem over the course of 1875 to 76. There were 5 Franciscan nuns, which is a denomination within Catholicism, who were exiled from Germany due to anti-Catholic laws that were passed in Germany at the time called the Falk Laws. And they were actually traveling to the U.S. to seek religious refuge in Wheaton, Illinois, right outside Chicago. But they didn't make it because the ship sank, obviously. And so this was very inspirational, a very moving event for Hopkins. It impacted him greatly, and that's why he composed the poem. As I said, it's a longer poem, but it's not really long, and there's plenty to unpack, but you can still follow the narrative fairly easily. There's part the first and part the second. What's important to note about the two parts, part the second is much longer. Part the first is really like a small kind of, well, if it were a play I'd call it soliloquy or monologue, but it's Hopkins, or I would say the speaker of the poem, but I think we can clearly say here that it's Hopkins discussing his faith. And so there's a lot to read into that, a lot to unpack there. I'm not going to go into it all now. This is a good point to mention that my goals when I discussed a literary text in the lecture. Certainly for longer ones like Macbeth and Dracula, we'll go into quite a bit of depth and detail, but I don't want to go into too much. I want to keep the lectures as short as I can, and also I want you to do the bulk of analysis, because the goal of the class is for you to learn, one of the goals is for you to learn how to do literary analysis. So I want to give you the tools, give you the background, give you the information, give you some analysis to set you on a successful path for answering the discussion board questions and doing analysis in that process. But and I'll give you some of my opinion, some of my argument about the literary works, but again, it's not going to be like me, reading my essay on these pieces, because again, I want you to pick them apart and come up with your own analysis. I'm going to be giving you some of that you can build off of. The goal is for you to build off of the lectures and the discussion board, and in the papers build off of the discussion board to the point where you're able to develop really strong, interesting literary arguments you support with close reading. So when you're reading the first part of the poem, consider what Hopkins is saying about his faith. Is he affirming his belief in God? Is he experiencing a crisis in faith? What is he saying there? Think that through. And then when you turn to part the second, you'll see that it discusses the narrative of the wreck. So you still have Hopkins' voice coming through, but there's less use of the first person. There's more focus on what's happening during the wreck, and he's describing that very vividly. So that's why the second part is longer, and that shift is important. Hopkins' voice starts to come. It never goes back fully to him, but it starts coming through more again in the end. Not thorough enough that I think that's why he didn't separate out apart the third, but you do have sort of a pattern here where it's all Hopkins, mainly the wreck with some Hopkins, and then the wreck intermixed with a lot more Hopkins. So it comes full circle in a way. And this is important because it relates to that concept of end stress. So consider end stress here. Why is Hopkins, this Jesuit priest who was a very talented, but reclusive poet who wrote in secret, who did struggle with a crisis in faith at some points, why is he writing this poem about these Catholic nuns who were drowned in exile? Obviously there's some connections there, since they belong to the same religion. They're exiles, and he, never quite fit in all the way. He felt different from his peers because he was poetic and artistically minded. By his peers of fellow priests and Catholics. But he's able to identify with these nuns. So remember, end stress is that ability to kind of recognize the suffering and plight of human condition of other individuals. So, think through why has he chosen to focus on this incident and write this really beautiful poem on it, and go into such depth and detail with describing the incident, but yet he's coming through talking about his own faith at the same time. Thinking that through and coming up with some answers to those questions will really tell you a lot about the poem. Consider imagery. This will be the final point here. So in the discussion board, I've asked you to consider imagery. Both the first slide in this lesson and then the lens text reading from Purdue Owl on poetry talked about the importance of imagery in poetry. Authors can do a lot with poetry, with imagery. In this poem, Hopkins is known for his images, and this poem is filled with them. I've listed all the ones I could think here off the top of my head. Water, sand, thunderstorms, the human body, birds, fire, dust, flowers, music. There's references to harvest. There's a ton of religious references to Jesus, the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, obviously Noah's Ark, and plenty of others. So you don't have to pick one of these. Pick any one you want. These are just some I noticed if you're having trouble thinking of one. And in the discussion board, talk about how does this image function in the poem? What is Hopkins doing with it? What is he trying to convey to the reader? The Purdue Owl reading talked about gut reaction to images. Images often provoke. So when you encounter, what I would say is read through the poem, probably more than once. It takes about 15 to 20 minutes to read, and the lesson is only going to be about half an hour, 40 minutes long. So it's about an hour and a half of your time. I would try to read through it multiple times, 2 or 3 times, and read through slower later times and make a lot of notes in the margin. A novel, it's always good to read more than once, especially the more complex ones, but poems, because they're shorter, you really can't get everything just reading it one time through. And since the reading load is light, like I said, read through it multiple times, take notes, try to get a really good feeling for it. Once you've done that, pick an image that stands out to you. This image keeps coming up or it really stands out to you. You fixate on it for some reason and look at that gut reaction. How is it making you feel? And then think about why would Hopkins want you to feel that way? And answer that question should get you to answering the question on the discussion board of how does the image function in the poem. And once you've done that, you do that successfully on the discussion board, you really have a good example of how to analyze poetry by looking at imagery. So again, that's the goal of including this text beyond it being a beautiful reading as we talk about poetry and how to analyze poetry as, the oldest literary genre, style, and form. I said read it multiple times, take notes, read it more slowly other times. Also read for that sprung rhythm. If you can, try to pronounce the syllables with the accents and read it out loud. Hear how it sounds. Don't just read it in your head. Kind of like revising a paper, proofreading a paper before you turn it in an essay. Just reading it on the page or on the screen, it's harder to hear your grammatical errors and sentences that sound off compared to when you read it aloud. Similarly, because people couldn't read, the vast majority of the population for thousands of years, poetry was primarily spoken and read out loud. So read it, obviously by the time Hopkins was writing, most people could read, but read it out loud anyway and see what effect it has. And you can also watch this video here if you click on the link and go to the link. So do that. The animation of the picture is kind of funny, but the speaker does a really good job of reading the poem. So hopefully hearing it that way will help too with your understanding of it. Okay, this lesson has 2 parts, just like the first lesson. As I mentioned last time, the first 3 lessons will be in 2 parts because we're going to talk about the 3 key components of writing a literary analysis, a critical analysis essay. Last time we talked about close reading, which is the most fundamental element. Ideally, we do it any time we read literature. And so that's why we covered it first, but obviously close reading is how you support or defend an argumentative topic. So obviously you have to develop the topic. Quite a few professors, especially in a class that's an introduction to literature class, would give you a more specific prompt or give you a specific question to answer. I don't do that at any level of any class. I believe one of the most fundamental elements of literary analysis and writing in general, after close reading, the next most fundamental, most important key element is the ability to come up with an idea, to develop a topic. So one of the 3 main ways I'm grading you, and the biggest way I'm grading you in your paper is, aside from the close reading, is what kind of topic did you come up with. And so it's not a simple, here's a question, figure out an answer, and then defend that answer. It's an essay. Each essay is one where you want to take some time and figure out what is a really good topic to write on. And always feel free to email me with any questions about your topics. Look at some ways to do that. So essay topics should be argumentative, which means a debatable claim. Debatable means others would disagree with it. If it's not debatable, if pretty much everyone you meet or anyone who's read that text would agree with it, it's not really debatable, it's not really an argument. So the topics need to be argumentative. It's hard to think of exactly what that means with literature sometimes, so I'll give you some examples of what that's not. It's not review-style commentary, or this is a great poem. When you read movie reviews or read blogs, they'll tend to be quite a bit of commentary, and that'll typically be in the form of whether they liked the text or not, and why they liked it. But it can be very general and not specific. You want to be very specific about your argument, focusing on a specific issue and taking a clear stance on that issue. It always is more fun and makes sense to choose to write on something you like, but it ultimately is inconsequential whether you like it or not. We're not evaluating the text, we're analyzing them. So a review evaluates things. An argument persuades the reader through analysis. And those are two very different techniques. Hopefully the difference is clear. It's also not summary. With literary texts, with in-depth plots and a lot of historical background, it's easy to go into summary and just present this historical information to readers. Again, that's not an argument. The two reasons here is when you're writing a literary analysis paper, in terms of review style, you're not looking to... People who read literary analysis papers aren't looking to see whether you liked the work or not. They would go somewhere else for that. They'd go to Amazon or the newspaper. They're also not looking for a summary of it, because they can look that up themselves on Wikipedia or SparkNotes, or they can read the book themselves. So you want to avoid these things, again, for the reasons I just said, and also because they're not arguments. So start with something you're interested in, and or it stands out to you. Maybe a recurring symbol in a work, like the water in Hopkins's poem, or blood in Dracula, or it could be a recurring theme or motif, something that stands out that you latch onto and fixate on and find interesting. Start to think about why this is interesting. How does it function in the work? What purpose does it serve? Why did it stand out to me? How and why is the author using it? Once you answer those questions, you can kind of formulate an opinion about the thing you're interested in, and thus an opinion, obviously that's closer to an argument, so we're heading along the right track here. Also, you could think about thematic things, for instance, race, class, gender, etc., religion, imperialism, crime, science, all kinds of things. You can write on pretty much anything you want, as long as it's clearly related to the literary text you're writing about. So find what's interesting and develop an opinion about it is the place to start. Once you've found something you're interested in, you have some initial thoughts. This is what I think about it type thoughts. How do you turn that into an argument and an essay? Is the question we're gonna answer here. Either come up with a stance of your own. For instance, something like Hopkins uses water to symbolize the spiritual burden he felt during a crisis of faith. So the weight on his back, not physically, but the burden he feels as being a priest is symbolized by the sheer volume of water you see in the poem that's ripping apart the ship and killing these people. So that's just something, reading the poem, I said, hey, that's an argument I came up with. So you can come up with the argument entirely on your own. If you feel like you're struggling with that, and you think, I have what I'm interested in, I don't know what to say about it, research what the thing you're interested in and see what other people have said about it. Because sometimes you need to read someone else's opinion to provoke your own thoughts if they aren't being provoked enough on their own. So maybe you'll do some research into the topic and see, hey, this person says this about it. I totally disagree with that. That doesn't make sense. Or I see what they're saying here, but they left something out. This is really important. They overlooked this. And so that reading what other people have said can help generate, your thoughts. So I'm going to talk about how to research a topic here, so that you can do that. You want to use short words, as few words as possible when you're searching for something. And for instance, in a search box, I wouldn't put in Hopkins's crisis of faith as expressed in Wreck of the Deutschland. I would just use the key word, to narrow the search for each one. Otherwise, you either won't get any results or too many the other way. Even if you come up with your own argument, you still need to do research to see what other people have said, because you don't want to just be repeating what someone else has said. So research is a key part of the process either way. The stage it comes in is what varies. And the next lesson we'll discuss research in more detail. For writing on literature, these are the library databases to use at ASU. We're going to go through them in a minute. MLA, which is Modern Language Association, JSTOR, and Project Muse. Modern Language Association is the one most narrowly focused entirely on literature. So it's the best one. ASU has such a big, resourceful library that almost everything in there is full text. You'll find some things that aren't full text, but if you do, you can request them through interlibrary loan. You'll see a button that says ILL. Just click on that and make an account, and you can request it. If you have any questions about that, email me. JSTOR, everything is full text, but they don't have everything up to the last 2 or 3 years, whereas MLA has everything right up to 2015. And it's also much bigger, so you'll get stuff on there not as directly related in your search that you'll have to sort through. Project Muse is even narrower than MLA, and everything is full text. So that's great in that sense, but there may be things you're missing. I would use Project Muse, but I wouldn't only use Project Muse. I'd use a combination of MLA and Project Muse, and then if I were having trouble finding things, I might turn to JSTOR. You can certainly use Google Scholar as well. I would not just use Google or a generic search engine, because you might find things that aren't scholarly, that aren't proofread by other professors before they're published. That shouldn't be as much of an issue on Google Scholar. You're still going to get way more results, and not everything is peer-reviewed, so you will have to do some sorting through on Google Scholar. But if you're having trouble with these three databases, Google Scholar wouldn't be the worst place to use to turn. Never cite Wikipedia in a paper. You can certainly use Wikipedia as a starting place to get some basic information. It maybe help you think of ideas to write on. It's kind of a stepping stone, but never actually cite that work, even if you do use it to start out. Alright, here are the steps for doing the research. So lib.asu.edu, we're a Research One school. We have an amazing library, and you can access the majority of what you need online. Even a lot of the books are digital now. I'm able to do most of the research for my dissertation using the website for the library, even though I live in Washington State. So lib.asu.edu, and you want to click on the one that says databases there. And then you'd want to click on the letter of the database you need, so M or J or P or something else depending on which database you're looking for. If you haven't logged in, you'll have to, but it's just the same login you use for MyASU. And then you'll just click on the connect next to the one you want. So MLA bibliography is the one I tried to highlight on the screenshot there. And then here's the search boxes. Again, you want to use as few words as possible. And so you would either put a plus sign in between them or click add a row and put end here. And do the search. So for Hopkins, Faith, and Deutschland, because I'm thinking about writing on his crisis of faith as expressed in that, I chose those 3 words. Like I said before, use as few words as possible. If there's separate boxes, like in MLA, put each word in a different box. If not, put a plus sign in between them. If you do search for words together, put quotation marks around them. I would limit that only to 2 or 3 words at a time, or phrases that you know will come up together. For instance, I could have done the same search with wreck of the Deutschland. It just would have taken me longer to type. Also, if you have a word with multiple spellings, say multiple suffixes on the end, you can use an asterisk to search for all of them. For instance, if for some reason you are searching the word category and you put the asterisk after the R, you would get, that would search for category, categorize, categories, categorizes, and any other letters that came after the R. So, say feminine or feminist or feminism, same type of thing you're searching. So those are just helpful hints for what to type in search boxes. Here's our results for Hopkins and Faith and Deutschland. So you can see there are 5 results, which is not bad. It's certainly better than when you get a ton of results. You probably don't want more than 25. 5 might be too few depending on the project. It wouldn't be for this class. But you could also look at the bibliographies for these works and find more sources that way. You can search for them. Maybe they didn't come up in this search, or you find them elsewhere on the internet. You would want to look through, make sure there's one fairly recent. These are all really old, except for this semantic counterpoint here. So 2004, about 11 years old, that's right at the edge of how old you want to use. Now, in certain situations, you'll need to cite older text, but in terms of basic research, you want to look for the most recent thing first. If you go all the way back, then you have to read more, because you be reading everything that came after. If you read the most recent thing on the topic, it should summarize all the research that came before. So you want to find the most recent one. If it's more than 10 years old, you may want to refine your search. 15 at the most. 2004, I'd say that's good enough to fudge it on this particular topic. So look for the newest article. Only read the first few pages of an article when conducting research. Their argument should be clear in the first page. If it's not a good article. And their research they've done that's come before should be clear in the first 2 or 3 pages, otherwise it's not a good article. And you don't have time to read the full text of everything. So ideally the author will do their own literature review, which is the type of component of your papers we'll talk about in the next lesson, in the first few pages. So find their argument. If it makes sense, it seems to be similar enough to what you're writing on that their research is going to be the research you need, then look for that literature review and read that too, but don't read the whole essay. By reading their literature review, there should be some kind of consensus in there. So you should get a general, what they call a critical history, or the general consensus of what scholars and critics think about this topic from reading those first 2 or 3 pages from that literature review. And that can tell you, oh, this is what other people think about it. Now I can see how that relates to what I think about it. And then if you need to cite those people, you can look at the author's works cited to find their names of their articles and their names. Okay, so you've done the research. You have a topic you're interested in. You've done a quick search that has maybe the author's last name, the title of the text, and then a word that signifies your topic, and you found an article that's recent and it outlines the other research. So you've done the research, you know what critics think about it. How do you then proceed from there and develop your own topic? I'm going to give you an example. So a couple years ago I was writing an essay on Charles Dickens' novel Our Mutual Friend, and I was really interested in the animals in it because he calls these characters birds of prey. So I found the use of that term really interesting. I wanted to write about it. As I went back through the book and tried to come up with my own argument, I thought, the heroic or likable characters are described as animals, but in a positive way. You typically see villains described as animals or outsider, exile type of characters who live on the periphery of society, the insane, the criminal. They're often described in animalistic ways, but you usually don't have the heroic characters described in animalistic ways. So I thought that was interesting. But I didn't go much beyond the way, usually when people or characters are described as animals, it's degrading. It wasn't degrading with the positive characters. So that seemed interesting. But the problem was, that's not very unique or original or interesting, right? The good characters are described in a good way, the bad characters are described in a bad way. That's not really insightful. So I needed to do something more with it. So I turned to research to help me, as I suggested you do if you're struggling like I was struggling here. So when I did searches for Our Mutual Friend plus birds plus animals, with the asterisk after the L or after the D, and everything I got was very outdated. I mean, really outdated, from like the 60s. No one had really done anything or much of anything with animals in this text. So I had to think about it. I thought about the time it was published, the 1860s, what was going on with animals at that time. Well, Darwin's Origin of the Species came out in 1859. So I started thinking about doing a search with Darwin and Dickens. Because, Dickens probably read Darwin in the 1860s. That was such an influential text, Origin of the Species. So if you're struggling, another thing you can do is look up the year your text came out on Wikipedia, and you'll know the big things that happened that year, and that might give you some ideas. So I searched for Dickens' Darwin and Our Mutual Friend before I had bird or animal in this box with an asterisk after the D or the L. And I got better results. Only 3. But again, I have one from 2011. So at the time I was working on this project, this article was only 2 years old. But now it'd still only be 4 years old. So within 5 years is a really good standard. And she had a great bibliography and clearly outlined the research. So I was able to, in natural history, I hadn't thought of that word either until I saw this after I thought of Darwin. So Darwin, natural history, these are other words that clearly the essay is going to talk about animals, even though it never came up when searching under animals or birds. So if you're not getting results in your search, try to think of other words that might work, and doing some kind of research on Wikipedia or Google might help you think of other words. Natural history is obviously going to contain information about animals, so are discussions of Darwin. So here's the part of the essay, that one from 2011, that talks about the other articles. This is the literature review, essentially. So this is where I want to see the current debate. So if you read it, more than one critic has regarded Dickens's Our Mutual Friend as the last of a series of attacks on mid-Victorian political economy. Dickens' fierce critique of a Malthusian-inflected political economy found its first expression in these books. A large number of historians of science have mapped Malthus's essay on population onto Darwin's account of struggle for existence, Darwin himself having cited it as an important influence. So what they're saying is, Dickens we read Malthus last time. Dickens was very kind of opposed to that way of thought. He was all about helping the poor, and obviously there's some parallels between Malthus and Darwin, because Darwin's writing about we're struggling for our existence and the most dominant species survive, which is a very crude summary. Darwin's more nuanced than that, but for the point here, to get the general idea, that's enough for now. So they're basically saying Dickens is anti-Darwin, is the summary of this research here, because of the similarities between Darwin and Malthus. So anti-Darwin is, in one phrase, you have the summary of all this research. And then I could go, Fulwiler was the other article that came up in that search, so now I can go and I can say what other people think about Dickens and Darwin and Dickens and animals is that Dickens is anti-Darwin. So he probably thinks human and animals are very different then. So now I know what I'm responding to. And here you have the work cited. So from here I can find all those other people I need to cite in my essay to show I've done the research and look up their articles. So here's the example of, now that I've done the research, how do I then take my very mundane thesis statement and make it a much better thesis statement? The critical consensus is the term I use to describe what all the critics say about the thing. So Dickens critiques Darwin because it resembles Malthusian economics. Dickens is anti-Darwin because of the similarities between Darwin and Malthus. That's what all these other writers think about Dickens and Darwin. So what would be unique? How could I say something different? How could I add something to that conversation? Is the question you ask yourself. Find your topic, do the research, figure out what the research says, think of something you could do differently that would be unique to add to that conversation. That's how you use the research to come up with a topic. So, I say maybe Dickens liked Darwin, maybe he was pro-Darwin. Is there any support, any evidence for that in the text, or is that just me trying to disagree with the critics? Let's see. I did come up with something, and here's what I came up with. Likeable characters are described as animals in a positive way. It's kind of embracing the similarities between humans and animals here, which would be a little more pro-Darwin. So I went back to the text and looked for those examples. So thinking about your original thesis after you've done the research, even if you didn't have a very good thesis to start with, can help you figure out your better thesis after you've done the research. So this must mean then that Dickens is not entirely opposed to comparisons between humans and animals. So now I came up with a new thesis that's much more unique and interesting. Dickens embraces Darwinism in Our Mutual Friend to a certain extent when Lizzie Hexam, who is constantly compared to a bird of prey, uses her animalistic strength instinct and energy to save Eugene Rayburn from drowning. So she does a good thing humans would value, and she's able to do it because of her animalistic attributes Dickens ascribes to her. So this seems like kind of embracing evolution here to me, which would go against what the critics said, which makes it much more unique and interesting than what I had before, and also adds to that discussion the critics are already having. I'm not just repeating what they have said. I'm doing something different but still related, which is the goal with writing a thesis. So to summarize then, the 5 points you want, or the few points, I'm not sure exactly how many, you want to remember are: find something interesting in the text, try to reason out your own argument about it, do some research, figure out what the research says, go back to your thesis, think about how you can say something unique, and then say that. So that's, I would say, the best way to come up with a topic for this kind of paper. And again, you can always email me, ask me questions about your topics. I'm always happy to help in any way I can.